Did Jesus exist? That's the question we're going to talk about in this video. This is February the 3rd, 2020. My guest is Venerable Panabasa Mahatera. Welcome back, Venerable.
Yeah, hail Brian.
And we should tell the audience, now you have your Logitech C920 digital camera on your laptop, just like I do. So your donors paid for this and bought this for you. So now you have greater clarity, which is what Buddhism is all about, greater clarity.
So now you can look at my scruffy face in HD.
That's right. And sometimes you'll shave.
Gotta shave. Yeah, I got to shave today, in fact, after this is done.
Okay. So next Monday, we'll see a more clean-shaven month then. Yeah, so I can imagine the comments already. It's a topic that's come up a few times in the videos, whether Jesus Christ existed. I wrote a book 20 years ago, freeing the Buddha, a chapter called Rescuing Jesus from the Christians. At that time, I believed that Jesus did exist. My thesis was that he didn't need all this supernatural baggage that was added later. But now I've studied Joseph Atwell. He's published a book, and I've seen his videos. And he thinks that after Emperor Nero died in 69 AD, that Emperor Flavius and his son was dealing with a Jewish messianic movement they wanted to put down. So his theory is that they very cleverly and skillfully hired the people to invent this character of Jesus Christ and backdate him to 30 to 33 AD as a way to create a split within the Jewish community, because he would say, turn the other cheek to make them more peaceful and less revolutionary, and give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and give unto God what is God's. So his thesis was this was a clever ploy by the Romans to divide the Jewish community, like to create a different sect within Judaism, and it worked to the advantage of Rome. So Rome just kept this thing going. Then, of course, history goes and then it takes over the Roman Empire.
Always in favor of it, because there was quite a few that persecuted the Christians. They didn't like Christianity all that much.
Yeah, so that was his story. Yeah, so I'm inclined to think that he did not exist. Of course, if I was really nice and politically correct, I would say, oh yeah, sure he did. And I'm very sympathetic to the Christian religion. Actually, we have a friend, Apollonian, who's been on the show, and he's a real Christian scholar. He's a Christian. Actually, he believes that Christ is a composite figure of past figures or gods, and that he didn't actually exist. Apollonian actually states that in our last video. I was quite impressed that someone of his stature a Christian would admit that. So,
well, just being a composite figure doesn't mean that the original person didn't exist. Like there was an original King Arthur, even though he wasn't called Arthur, and there's a good chance that there was like a composite of like 2 or 3 different people that got combined together to make King Arthur. But nevertheless, there was like some real people. Like there was one, he was a British chieftain named Riothalmus in the texts, or Rigodamus, depending on which text it is, who, he was like one of the British leaders who were fighting against the Anglo-Saxons that were trying to take over England at the time. So yeah, or like Hercules. Hercules was a heck of a long time ago, like during the Greek Dark Ages, or even before the Greek Dark Ages. He was like a Dorian hero, and there's a good chance there was an original Hercules, like an original,
real human being,
like an original Achilles, and like the people from the Trojan War, like the Iliad. But even so, most of the stories about them might be fake. Or like Hercules, he got turned into a god, and so the way the Greeks and the Romans operated is when they would spread out into new areas, if the people were already worshiping some god or some hero, they would just pick the Greek or Roman god or hero that it came the closest to, and just call him by that name, so that all the legends about this other god or hero that was worshipped by the non-Greeks or whatever would just get amalgamated into the whole myth of Hercules or whoever it was. And even the Buddha, to some degree, is a composite, because you start off with the historical Gautama, the philosopher Gautama of the Shakya clan, but then like fake Buddhist scriptures get cooked up by other monks or other people. And so it was these other monks' words get put into the Buddha's mouth, which makes the Buddha himself, to some degree, a composite because not all of his ideas are really his ideas. Well, a lot of it is just like Mahayana stuff that gets added and put into his mouth.
Yeah, I see. Yeah.
So just because somebody is a composite doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't an original guy that the whole story is based on, even though the story that came down to us might be very different. You know, like most of the stories about King Arthur and the Round Table is just made up later. You know, the original guy that King Arthur is based on probably didn't have Sir Lancelot and you know,
or a round table
magician and all that. Yeah, the Round Table.
It wasn't round.
Yeah.
Yeah. I suppose his deeds. I think there's a video saying Jesus is patterned after an ancient Egyptian god Horus from like 3000 BC.
Well, in the ancient or like the early Roman Empire, there was a number of different myths about a god who dies and then comes back to life again. Like Dionysus also died and came back to life, and also there was Venus and I can't remember if it was. I don't think it was Adonis. There was another like a Semitic, like a Phoenician god that was really a big deal, like north of Israel, like in Syria and Phoenicia. I can't remember who it was, but that was another big one in ancient times of a god who dies and then comes back to life again. And I think maybe I'm not sure about Mithras, but I think maybe Mithras also died and came back to life again. So for some reason,
a lot of them like that. Yeah,
I don't completely understand. There was just like a fashion for religious cults based on a god that dies and then comes back to life again. There were several.
The movie was Zeitgeist was the YouTube video that had this video. Yeah, and the idea of with Christmas, the sun goes down December 22nd, and 3 days later it starts to come back by the 25th. The idea of death and rebirth with the seasons, sort of an idea, and the stars, astrology.
That was an important part of it. Like Persephone, the whole myth of Persephone is like that, where she's married to the god Pluto, so she has to go underground for half the year, and then she gets to be above ground for half the year. And that's symbolic of winter and summer and the seasons and how the crops don't grow during half the year, and then they do grow the other half of the year. And so there was a lot of that kind of symbolism in mythology.
Yeah, a lot to do with farming and astrology, or astronomy.
That in itself wouldn't indicate that Jesus didn't really exist, or some person that the whole story is based on.
Well, what I read is that there's really no documents or record at that time around 30 AD. It wasn't until around 70 AD that we get these documents. Like the disciples, when they would get old and they would write, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. All this appears later, but nothing contemporary. And Roman Empire, they had some sophistication. They had paper, they had writing. People would take notes. They kept records. It seems that there wasn't any record of anything until around 70 AD. That's suspicious.
Well, the beginning is that at first Jesus just wasn't famous. So he's not going to be making news. Nobody's ever heard of him, and so nobody's going to write about him. Like how many people who got crucified as a political criminal are famous? Maybe Spartacus. But there's not very many. I mean, he was just a carpenter's son. According to the legend, even. Yeah. And so he just didn't get famous until his cult started getting big. And there were probably lots of little cults, sort of like, on the fringe.
And other people claim to be the Messiah, right? There's quite a few Messiahs around, or people want to be Messiah or wannabes.
everyone was, all the Jews were expecting a Messiah at any time. And so, somebody comes along that's a little bit above average, they're claiming he's the Messiah, and Jesus was another one. But the Jesus cult struck traction for some reason, whereas the other ones just died out. And even in the New Testament, they're talking about how, I think it's in the Sanhedrin, the Jews in Jerusalem and at the Sanhedrin are trying to figure out what to do about this Jesus person. And then one of them says, don't worry, there was that other Jesus a while back that he had a big following and he just died out. So this will probably be the same way. But of course, the guy was wrong because
maybe it's Paul. The idea of Paul, he's described as the founder of the Christian religion. That he never met Jesus, but he really built it up and said, we got to bring in the Gentiles to expand this. It's not enough to make it Jewish.
according to the scholars, the oldest parts of the New Testament are the epistles of Paul. And not all of the epistles of Paul are authentic. They say some of them are, they're fake epistles of Paul, or were just written by somebody else, and then everyone thought it was by Paul. But Paul, he was a contemporary of Jesus. I mean, his earliest writings come from, 35 or maybe 30 years after Jesus died, something like that. And even though he never met Jesus, he was like an anti-Christian. He was persecuting the Christians. He was on his way to Damascus to persecute the Christians there. And then he had his, whatever happened to him, his vision. He gets struck blind, and then Jesus is talking to him or whatever. And then he goes off into the desert for like 3 years, cooking up this new system. And then
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and then only after he spent 3 years just developing his own idea of what Christianity should be like, then he goes to Jerusalem and meets the followers of Jesus. So he meets Paul, he meets Peter, he meets James, who's supposedly the brother of Jesus.
And he was the leader. I think James was the leader of the order.
I think so. Yeah.
So he was the Paul and James were headbutting about who's going to be the leader.
He was like the elder in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think James, based on the one epistle of James in the New Testament, was much wiser than Paul was. It's kind of too bad that James didn't write more or didn't have more authority in later Christianity.
Yeah.
That's too bad. But supposedly, Paul did meet with the followers of Jesus, like the original disciples that were still there in Jerusalem anyway. And he met quite a few people that supposedly were followers of Jesus himself. So there is that. But there was one, also might as well add again that if they really did find his bones back around 1980, then that would be a good indication. But I don't know how you could really prove it. It just seems like one heck of a coincidence.
Yeah, it was on the ossuary. It said James, brother Jesus. They flew it into Toronto, and I think they dropped and they broke the ossuary by mistake. And I think the bones I think the bones are tossed out because they weren't regarded as having any value until someone translated, this is James' brother Jesus. All they had was the ossuary, the container, but they tossed the bones out.
Maybe. I'm not sure what happened to the bones, but that was just one of the ossuaries. Okay. There was a whole family crypt that got accidentally dug up by construction workers in Jerusalem back around 1980. They're trying to level the ground to build something, and they accidentally break through into this crypt underground. And it's the law in Israel, I guess. You find any kind of ancient ruins or something like that, you find an ancient artifact or ancient anything, you have to contact the government, and then they'll send people from, the University of Tel Aviv, the archaeology department or something. So it was like the next day, the archaeology department shows up and they find several of these ossuaries down in this burial chamber, and at least one was missing. So somebody had already stolen at least one of them by the time that the archaeology guys got there. And the one was, I don't remember the original Jewish names. I'll just go with like the King James version. But they found one for Jesus, one for Mary, one for Jude, who was the son of Jesus, whereas in the Bible he's the brother of Jesus. Although maybe he just named his kid after his favorite brother or something. I don't know.
But having a kid is scandalous. Him and Mary Magdalene having a kid. What?
Yeah, well, it wasn't necessarily Mary Magdalene, but then again, back in those days, the Buddha also got married and had a kid before he went off and became a spiritual teacher. And maybe Jesus did the same thing. He just kind of moved on, renounced the world and became a renunciant or something. And who knows? But also there was, I think there was one for Joseph, and then there was one for in the Bible. The English translation he's called Joseph, who was one of the brothers of Jesus that's mentioned. And so they had all these names, and like the family connections were close and everything. But one of the problems is that the names are so common. Like Mary or Miriam, that's the most common name for a Jewish woman in those days.
But to say
So
James, brother of Jesus,
yeah,
implies that Jesus must have been an important person to say that this guy's the brother of that person.
yeah.
That
And
adds
then
some weight.
later with regard to that ossuary you're referring to, they did an analysis on the patina, the dust and the bacterial stuff on the surface of it, and they found out that it matches the ones that they found in the crypt. So that was probably stolen from there before the archaeology people showed up. But it was just part of this whole family burial chamber. So, but all the names are really common except for Joseph. So
Oh,
it's not really proof. It's just some good circumstantial evidence that maybe Jesus really existed. And also, I remember reading in Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, where it was sometime later after Christianity was kind of taken off, but there were like different sects of Christianity. There were the Ebionites who were they were still Jews. They were just Jews who thought Jesus was the Messiah. Whereas, of course, Paul was trying to get away from the Jews. He's saying, you don't need to be circumcised. You don't have to follow the Jewish law, any of that kind of stuff. But then there were some that still followed it. And there were two guys who claimed to be relatives of Jesus, or they were like descendants of one of his brothers or sisters or something. And so the Sanhedrin or the Roman government, I can't remember which, they're kind of on yellow alert, so they have them brought in, and they're just these poor farmers, and they obviously weren't any danger to anybody, so they just let them go.
that's good.
Yeah.
Wow.
But one of the things I wanted to talk about with regard to whether Jesus was real or not is I used to study a lot the ways of finding out what are the most ancient Buddhist texts and what is more likely to be authentic and what's likely to be fake, that kind of stuff. I've been doing a certain amount of detective work on the Pali Tipitaka, the Buddhist texts, to try and increase the odds of understanding what the Buddha really taught, what the original Buddhism was like. And one of the tricks that they use is if you've got like two alternative versions of the same text, then the more awkward or embarrassing one is more likely to be the real one. Because
that makes sense, yeah, because they would edit it.
Yeah, because they would edit it to make it look better, and nobody's going to make up something that's awkward or hard to explain or kind of embarrassing. So any kind of made up stuff is more likely to be, going along with the whole legend of the miracles and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, so like Jesus performs a miracle, that would be much more likely to be made up than Jesus trying to perform a miracle and he can't do it.
Yeah.
They wouldn't be as likely to make up the not being able to do the miracle story as, the fantastic miracle story.
Yeah, good point.
So there's a lot of that in the Bible too. There's like embarrassing, awkward things about Jesus's life that it just seems more likely that it would be based on a real person that then got turned into this story. It got modified rather than just made up out of nothing. Like the whole idea of Jesus living in Nazareth in Galilee. According to the Old Testament, the Messiah has to be born in Bethlehem. And so what the early Christians had to do, they had to cook up some explanation of how Jesus was born in Bethlehem when really everyone knew that he came from Nazareth in Galilee. How was it that he was born in this other place? And the New Testament has two entirely different versions of how Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Like in one version, the assumption is that his family was already in Bethlehem, but then because Herod was persecuting he was killing off all the baby boys, they had to run away and hide in Egypt. And then they came back. They were still afraid of Herod's son, so they moved to Nazareth. So that's one explanation. There's no mention at all of no room at the inn or being born in a manger or anything like that. But then the other version is that they were living in Nazareth already, but then Joseph had to go to Bethlehem for the census. Augustus Caesar declared a census, so he had to go register for the census in his family's ancestral hometown of Bethlehem. And so when they get there, there's no room at the end, and then the story of the manger and all that. And then supposedly after that, they just go right back home to Nazareth. So it's like two different attempts to explain how Jesus was born in Bethlehem when everyone knew that he came from Nazareth in Galilee. And so him being born in Nazareth instead of Bethlehem would be a good bit of evidence that he really was a person. It's just that he didn't fit the predictions for the Messiah, so they had to monkey with the predictions of the Messiah in order to make Jesus look like the Messiah. And there's a number of stories like that. Like also another embarrassing one for the Christians is, why is it that when Jesus is nailed up on the cross, he cries out, my God, why have you abandoned me? I mean, especially if Jesus is God, why would he be saying that God abandoned him?
Yeah, he wouldn't be talking to himself.
Well, yeah, he'd be talking to God the Father, but still, why would God the Father abandon him, and why would he yell that? And it's just kind of this embarrassing, awkward thing that Christians have had a lot of difficulty explaining. And each different sect of Christianity has its own explanation. So you could write a whole book just on the different explanations of why Jesus cried out, my God, why have you abandoned me? Some of the explanations are interesting, and some of them are just dumb. Like the Jehovah's,
metaphysical, right?
Like the Jehovah's Witnesses, I mean, the guy was kind of embarrassed even when he was telling me, because he knew that it sounded like a dumb explanation. But according to the Jehovah's Witnesses, I was told the reason why Jesus yelled that is while he's nailed up on the cross, he looks into the future and he sees some Jehovah's Witnesses in a concentration camp in Nazi Germany who were being persecuted because of their Christianity. And so out of his sympathy for these Jehovah's Witnesses in the 20th century, he cries out, my God, why have you abandoned me? Which is, obviously a pretty...
That's all Hitler's fault. So evil. It's all evil. Probably got gas in them gas chambers. Wow. Yeah. I think a Jew got involved in that story. Actually, I think the Rothschilds created the Jehovah's Witnesses back in the 1800s. I think they were Rothschild born.
Yeah, whatever.
Another story.
Yeah. And then, like St. John of the Cross had his explanation of how, in order for Jesus to make the supreme sacrifice, in order to be worthy of atoning for everybody's sins, he had to lose everything. He had to make the absolute sacrifice in order for it to be enough for everybody to be forgiven of their sins. In order for him to save the world, he had to make the absolute supreme sacrifice. So even his connection with God the Father had to be cut for a short time. And that's why he cried that out. But I think my favorite explanation, even though I don't think it's...
That's kind of cool.
Yeah. I don't think it's even the true explanation, but there was a group of heretics. I think they were a kind of Gnostic back in the Middle Ages. They had this really cool idea that Jesus and the Christ spirit were two different beings. That Jesus was just ordinary Jesus, the carpenter's son. But then when he got baptized in the River Jordan by John the Baptist, the Spirit of the Lord came down like a dove and entered into him. And that Spirit of the Lord was the Christ entity entering into him. So it was like two beings, he was like Jesus, the carpenter's son, was possessed by the real Son of God.
Co-mingling conscious, like channeling to a David or together.
Something like that, yeah. And then it was, for some reason, after he gets nailed up on the cross, then the Christ entity just splits and just leaves Jesus, the carpenter's son, behind. And then all of a sudden it's, my God, why have you abandoned me?
Yeah, and he's suffering there. Wow.
Yeah. That's an interesting one.
Wow.
Although personally, my own theory as to why he yelled that is just he finally realized that he wasn't the Jewish Messiah. I think he thought he was the Jewish Messiah because he's got all these, he's able to do miracles, or at least he's able to heal the sick and this kind of stuff. He's got some kind of psychic powers using Buddhist lingo. So he just naturally assumes, because everybody's expecting the Messiah, and all of a sudden he's reached this higher level of consciousness, and he can heal the sick and all this. So he started thinking maybe he really was the one. And then when he gets nailed up on the cross, he finally realizes that he was mistaken. That's
so that he thought he would
survive. It's a Christian theory, but
so then he thought he wouldn't die. He was surprised that he would die then.
Well, the Jewish Messiah was going to be like a king.
Yeah.
He was going to lead his nation to be foremost among the nations and all this.
And to lead and live forever and ever, lead forever and ever, right?
Not necessarily, no. I mean, in the Old Testament, the promised Messiah is going to be like a political figure. He's going to be a king, and he's going to be
a human lifespan. Then
he's going to be a descendant of King David. He's going to be a branch.
Just live out his lifespan and then die and set up a kingdom.
Yeah. So I mean, the idea of the Messiah being like a spiritual, kind of a divine being, that came a lot later.
Oh, so it was more like the Jewish people wanted a political ruler like Netanyahu to expand Israel, the Greater Israel Project.
They were wanting, the lineage of King David to come back so that they'd have their kings again. Yeah.
So you're saying Jesus would be surprised that he would die. His magical powers would help him live through this and prevail.
He probably figured he was going to die sooner or later, but he didn't think that he was going to be tortured and put to death by the Roman government before he got the chance to really lead his nation to greatness. And that was another embarrassment to the Christians, is crucifixion. I mean, being nailed up on a cross wasn't something special they invented just for Jesus. That was for the slimiest scum to be executed. It was like pirates and rebellious slaves and insurgents and people like that, political criminals, which was what Jesus was. Yeah. Assuming that he existed, he was a political criminal. So he gets killed in this, like, the most degrading way possible. And that was another problem for the early Christians, although they were able to kind of work it into the theory that it had to be that way, sort of like making the supreme sacrifice again, so that.
But now it's such a symbol, the cross. You see it everywhere. It's a negative symbol. You see the cross, it's kind of a downer, to see him on the cross. Like seeing a sitting Buddha in a peaceful, calm, powerful state. That's a much more uplifting image than a Jesus on the cross.
Yeah. Yeah, and it couldn't happen to the Buddha because according to the Buddhist legends, the Buddha can't be killed.
Yeah, you cannot kill a Buddha, that's true. He can just disappear. You can get out of it.
Yeah,
Devadatta tried and failed.
Yeah, he did make him bleed a little bit, though, so.
Yeah.
Devadatta went to hell for that.
Yeah, I guess my view on Jesus, I think he didn't exist. I think it was a character made up later. Just on so many guests I've had on the show who really researched it, like P. Pop Heracles, Polanyi, and other people who study the history. I haven't studied a lot myself.
Well, how do you explain the embarrassing stuff, like him coming from Nazareth when he's supposed to come from Bethlehem, that kind of thing? It's just hard to explain.
Well, like you said, it could have been a real historical person that they had in mind. I mean, if the Romans invented the idea around 70 AD, they may have looked for a biography of someone at that time.
Yeah, I mean,
that's based upon a person.
That would be much more likely that it was, it was originally based on one person.
Could be.
Then just all this mythology gets tacked on, and most of the story didn't really happen, or it happened to somebody else, like Hercules. Or
yeah, that's true. I would give that much. That could have been the case, yeah. Unless they're just really creative writers and they threw in some embarrassing stories to make it look really realistic and true. Don't make them look glorious the whole time. That would be too suspicious. I don't know.
Yeah, but I mean, you'd be sabotaging what you're trying to accomplish by making it really awkward like that.
Yeah, although I never thought of Jesus' story awkward. Like the Buddha's life story is not bad. It's not embarrassing. There's just one story of his childhood, and he had, lots of girlfriends when he was young. He was treated well, but he doesn't really have any really embarrassing story with the Buddha. Yeah, I guess that supports your thesis, though.
Nothing really awkward that I can think of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Although we think the Buddha's a real historical figure.
Yeah, although it is kind of fishy that Mahavira, who's considered to be the founder of the Jain religion, or the latest founder of the Jain religion, his story is almost exactly the same as the Buddhist story. Although my guess is that they just copied the Buddhist myth, or the Buddhist legend.
Yeah, it could be. And that they are contemporaries, that they were in the same time and place.
But the Jain scriptures got lost. Because back in ancient India, they didn't write down scriptures. It was memorized by heart. But the Jains were such ascetics, they were such radicals, that there weren't very many scholars. They were out there torturing themselves in the wilderness. And so two different times, their scriptures were forgotten. There weren't enough monks that were memorizing it. And so then they had to have a council and reestablish the scriptures again. So it may be during one of those times when they're re-editing or redoing the scriptures that they came up with the legend of Mahavira being almost exactly the same as the legend of Siddhartha.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, I never knew that. You get such a great historical knowledge, Venerable Panapas. I appreciate your talks on history. Yeah, but back to Jesus, it could have been fashioned after an historical person. I don't believe all the supernatural things attributed to him, that all the people's sins are atoned for with his crucifixion, if you believe in Jesus, or a supernatural. I mean, supernatural stuff could have happened because the Buddha had supernatural powers. That's not such a big deal, really, to do stuff like that.
Yeah, or even him flying up into heaven. I mean, if those bones really are his, then that would pretty much be good evidence that he just died and stayed dead, rather than rising from the dead on the third day and then flying up into outer space. Yeah,
bodily raised into heaven. Yeah. So anything else on the historical Jesus? So do you conclude that you think he might be a composite then?
Yeah, well, it's just mentioning his brothers and sisters, and it's got the kind of embarrassing birth details and the embarrassing death details, and so it just seems likely to me that at the very least there was a real person who was like the nucleus that then they just add on the legend onto this one person. But it would make more sense to me than to say that they just invented it from scratch.
Okay, yeah. So I guess I would say that I don't think he existed, but when they made up the idea, they might have been looking through historical characters, and then they picked an historical character that they could embellish.
Yeah, well, then you just have to draw the line as to where you draw the line for somebody existing or not. Like King Arthur. I mean, did King Arthur exist? I mean, it all depends on how you want to interpret.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it
depends how you draw the line. If it really was based on this one person, and then some details from the life of this other person get added, and then during the Middle Ages they start, poets and playwrights and these kind of people are just cooking up all this fairy tale stuff about him, then I mean, the King Arthur in the movies never really existed, and the King Arthur in most of the books never really existed. But way back, like in the 5th century AD, after the Roman legions had withdrawn from Britain, and you've got some British rulers there trying to maintain some kind of Roman civilization against the invading Germanic tribes, then I would say that he probably did exist, but he's just very different from what history says about him. And I'd probably say the same thing about Jesus, that there really was an original person, but the official story about him might be radically different from what actually happened.
Yeah, I admit there could have been a person, but I believe that the Jesus Christ never existed. The meaning to a Christian, what it means, Jesus Christ, I think that person didn't exist.
Yeah, well, I mean, as a Buddhist, obviously, I don't think that he was really the Messiah. He turned into the Christian Messiah, but he wasn't the Jewish Messiah. And the Jews are still waiting for their Messiah. He hasn't come yet.
Yeah, but as Buddhists, we don't accept. Remember, the Dalai Lama once told the Christians, we don't accept the idea of such a unique being. Like, even the Buddha was not unique. He was like the 6th Buddha, and there would be future Buddhas as well, but there's not one special, unique Jesus Christ. We can't accept that from a Buddhist view, especially with karma and rebirth.
The Buddha wasn't God, and he wasn't the only begotten Son of God.
Yeah, that's true. So we don't regard Jesus as could possibly have been such a person from a Buddhist view.
Even in the New Testament, Jesus himself denies it. It's like there's one part of the Bible, this is another embarrassing one, where somebody calls him good sir or good teacher or something like that. And then Jesus says, why do you call me good? There is none good except God. And so that indicates that Jesus was not only denying being God, he was denying even being good.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so there's these embarrassing things like that it's hardly likely that anybody would make it up, unless maybe they were non-Christians that are trying to sabotage it by sneaking that in or something. But the embarrassing stuff, it really is fairly good evidence that something is more likely to be true, even though it's not really proof that anything is true. You can't really prove anything with 100% certainty.
Yeah. But you're the first one to tell me this, about the embarrassing things indicate that something's more likely true. I never thought about that until your talk now.
Yeah. It's just a technique or a method that's used by people that are examining ancient stuff to try to determine what's more likely to be true and what's less likely to be true. And it gets used a lot with regard to Buddhist texts also.
Yeah.
So that's how I know about it.
Apollonian's idea that Christ means truth. I like that. It's close to the Buddhist idea of Dhamma means truth. So I like saying, Christ means truth, and he says that Christ didn't even exist as such. I mean, that's kind of a nice thought to us. But,
yeah, I suppose, although etymologically Christ means anointed. It's like the Greek translation of the Jewish word for Messiah, which means anointed. So it means a king. Like in Pali, they talk about the head anointed king. Like a monk isn't supposed to walk past the bedchamber of a head anointed king if the treasure hasn't been taken out yet. There's a Pachitya rule about that you're not really the king until you get anointed. And etymologically, literally, that's what Christ means, is just anointed, because that's what Messiah means. And it's just the Greek word for Messiah. And with regard to Dhamma, I think literally it means something like law. So it doesn't mean truth. Truth would be satcha, like the Four Noble Truths.
Yeah, so Dhamma means law in the sense the way things actually are, the way reality is, that sense of law, like the law of karma.
Yeah, etymologically, it's similar to the verb daredi, which means to bear, to hold. So like with regard to law, it just kind of holds up society. You have to have law and order to hold up society, I guess. And then like in Abhidhamma, Dhamma came to mean any kind of reality. Anything that's real is called a Dhamma. There's these different Dhammas. And that's like some underlying reality that holds up the appearance of a thing is kind of what it meant. But it means literally holding up or bearing. But we've gotten away from Jesus. We're talking about Buddhism again.
Yeah, okay. Anything else you want to add on the historical Jesus?
No, not really. We've talked about Jesus before, so if people want to hear us talk more about Jesus, they'll have to look up the old one.
Yeah, let's refer people. We have a playlist called Buddhist Monk Truthers on both YouTube and here on BitChute, and on YouTube, I should say. Yeah. This is good. So it's we'll leave Jesus as a sacred mystery. At least to the Christians, it must be some kind of a sacred mystery.
Yeah, the mystery cult.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you kindly, Venerable Panapasa.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Please donate to the Brian Ruhe Show. And please copy these videos or find other YouTube channels that will accept these videos so we can spread this message further. Thanks.